you ever noticed this strange pull towards men who aren't quite right for you, even when you know they're not compatible with the relationship you actually want? Maybe you've been on a date and something feels familiar, not safe, definitely not secure or grounded, just familiar. And even though you can see the red flags, there's this magnetic pull that doesn't quite make sense. Smart, self-aware women experience this all the time, and then they blame themselves for it. You might think, is it my anxious attachment? Do I just have bad taste in men? I love the F-boys. Why am I attracted to emotionally unavailable men? Why do I keep choosing the same pattern again and again on repeat? And it feels personal, right? It feels like a flaw. You're like, why am I not getting this right already? Something is wrong with you. But here's the truth. It's not your attachment style, and it's not a lack of self-awareness. It's definitely not a character flaw. What's really pulling you is something much deeper and much older. It's a conditioning formed inside your family system. And I know you want to trust yourself in dating. You want to feel aligned, grounded in your power. You want to feel drawn towards the right men, men who feel safe, steady, and emotionally available. You want attraction that supports your future, not repeats your past. But here's the thing. Awareness hasn't changed the pattern. Attachment style quizzes haven't changed the pattern either. Reading lists, therapy sessions, affirmations, they help, but they don't really fully shift what you're experiencing in your dating journey to long-term partnership and life partnership or marriage, right? Because none of those things touch the root. In this video, I'm going to explain what's actually happening. What's actually happening underneath your attraction pattern, right? Without blame, without shame, and definitely without pathologizing yourself. By the end of this, you'll finally understand why certain men just feel oddly magnetic, even when you logically know they're not good for you. Let's go deeper than attachment styles today, and let's go deeper for a moment. Attachment theory explains how you connect to someone else. It's a theory about attachment. So it's a relational theory, right? It's about how you relate to someone else. What we're going to talk about today is family systems. And family systems explains why certain people feel like home, even when home may not have even been emotionally safe for you, right? Your family system is the original environment where you learned what love feels like, what attention feels like, what closeness feels like, what distance feels like, even what effort feels like, right? Inconsistency, what does that feel like? You learn all of this before you even had language, right? Your body picked up on cues before you even had words to express yourself. That's how deep-rooted this is. And you learned it through the emotional climate of your home. Now, here's the key piece. Your mind forgets, but your body and your nervous system remembers. It remembers the emotional tone of closeness. What did closeness feel like in your childhood home? Some of you, there were issues of feeling like you had to earn love. And sometimes it could feel unpredictable. Maybe as a child, you felt like you had to walk on eggshells to get your needs met. The emotional tone and feeling of responsibility for someone else's moods, right? And that emotional imprint becomes the blueprint of your adult relationships and what they basically run on. And this is why I often say, you don't choose the man, your system chooses the man, right? And not because you're broken, because you're unhealed, or even because you're unaware, but because your system is wired to recognize familiarity as safety, even when it's not. So things that feel familiar, your brain thinks that must be safe, but actually nothing could be further from the truth. If love felt like trying really hard, proving yourself, being the good girl, and that, let me tell you, being the good girl can also come in certain cultural backgrounds. For example, I'm South Asian, and I do coach a lot of women from Black and brown communities. And sometimes that good girl thing, that nice girl thing is really hard to break, because sometimes we are so raised to be the good girl in our childhood family that it can actually be quite difficult to be the sexy adult woman who actually wants to be in a grown-up adult relationship, right? Those are two different things. And those can be very different patterns to break, very difficult patterns to break. Caretaking, was there a sibling that you had to take care of? Was there a parent that you had to take care of that was either physically or maybe even mentally unwell? Did you have to attune to someone who was actually a little bit volatile? You were like super vigilant around, is this a good day for them? Is this a bad day for them? Have they come home extremely stressed? Are they in a playful mood? Do they have the bandwidth for me? You learn to become very vigilant to attuning to other people. And if you are one of these women, I know that you'll know who you are because you do it all the time in social environments, on dates. And it can actually make being around other people feel very stressful and unsafe, because it's literally, you feel like you're psychic. You can read all of their thoughts and feel all of their feelings. And this is a superpower, but it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. I feel you if you're one of these women, right? Maybe you actually had to be the emotional adult in the room in your childhood family, right? Whilst your parents were doing their thing, you kind of realized that there were certain things they just weren't very good at doing. An example that can come from a personal experience is because I was able to attune to the feelings and thoughts of other adults, I knew when, for example, one of my parents was not actually responding in a way to another adult that was going to get the thing they needed in that moment. I would often step in and be the smart adult child, and I was often praised for that as well, right? So sometimes it can look like small daily things like that, and sometimes it can actually be quite a big thing. Maybe, for example, you were always the one who had to apologize and say sorry because you knew your parent wasn't going to do that. And if you watched the last video, what we discussed there and what you already know now is the only thing your nervous system cared about in that phase of your life, which was the childhood phase where you were very much dependent on your caregivers and your parents, the only thing your nervous system cared about was actually maintaining the connection at any cost, because losing the connection can, on a body and a nervous system level, feel like death. It can feel like abandonment, and your survival was so based on your caregivers around you that there really wasn't room for that, right? Maybe you also learnt to minimize your needs or only state your needs at certain times, or maybe you just ended up becoming hyper independent and meeting your own needs in childhood because you just knew that your parents wouldn't be able to meet it on time or do it in the way that's actually going to benefit you. Earning validation, we also talked about this in the last video on green flags, which is, this is something to pay attention to in those early dates. And the women who tend to do this tend to have learnt that when you earn validation from someone, in this case a parent, that's when you receive love. And so we subconsciously might do that on dates as well, and it's something to pay attention to. If you learnt those things in your childhood, then your body will interpret those emotional cues as completely normal. How toxic is that? So you could be on a date with a man and there's a dynamic being set up where he's almost putting you in a position to justify yourself or to prove your value to him, and it's going to feel normal and maybe even relatable and good, versus actually that familiarity is something that should be setting off red flags in your mind. Like, no, no, no. Natural, healthy connection is actually quite stable, emotionally safe, and doesn't require for me to earn or prove or be validated. So those emotional cues you might have learned as normal, right? Even if they were extremely painful as a child. And you haven't learned this consciously, you haven't learned it logically or intentionally, but somatically, right? So you've learned it somatically from the body. And that's why I said at the very beginning, the body never forgets. And this is why emotionally unavailable men can just feel like home. They can feel like chemistry. It's why inconsistency can feel like that spark that you've been looking for. You've been searching your entire life for this whirlwind romance and it feels like home, right? Why chaos can feel like excitement. Why emotional distance can feel like a mystery. None of that is attraction. And it's actually really interesting to flip reverse these, we can call them red flags or signs of emotional unavailability. I've had so many men say to me, Lena, you're so mysterious because you don't really reply to my messages on time. And I've clocked, that's my red flag and you should be spotting that, right? But I'm a little bit on the avoidance side. And if that's not meeting your needs, that's not the right match for you, right? It's interesting to look at those things inside of us. How do we show up in that capacity? And it's also very important to be looking at that from the other side, that how does this person show up as emotionally available? And again, we talked about that in the last video. Where do I mirror these things? Where is there room for my own personal improvement? But also, where am I actually showing up quite strongly but accepting less than what I can give, right? Here's the baseline thing that I want you to know. It's going to feel really obvious, but if you're resonating with any of this stuff, then you're going to know how hard this is to break, right? None of the above, none of that is attraction. It's recognition. Your nervous system is quite literally saying, this feels like home, not this is healthy and this is what we should be aiming for, right? And here's something that often surprises women. Even if you had a good childhood, there are very subtle ways this can form. This is one of the blocks that a lot of my clients trip up at, especially if they came from cultures. Again, I can speak on behalf, well, not on behalf of South Asian culture, but I can speak on what it felt like to be raised in a South Asian family in my own very personal and individualistic circumstances, that from certain cultural backgrounds, there is this feeling of owing your parents everything. There is dialogue that runs quite frequently, which is, my parents sacrificed everything for me. They worked really hard so I could have these privileges in life. I owe them everything. I should be super grateful for them. And we have this loyalty that sometimes doesn't fall in love, because love is brilliant, right? So the loyalty doesn't come under the guise of love. It comes under this umbrella of duty and obligation. And sometimes what can trip women up from these backgrounds, and this definitely had a part to play in my journey, is we have so much love, adoration, and respect for our parents that we're scared that looking at what really happened in our childhood home means having to disown our families, not love them anymore, go no contact, go low contact, become estranged from them, blame them and label them as bad people. And here's the thing, you could have had a very loving childhood, but your parents just got it wrong a little bit, because guess what? They're human beings, right? And maybe they were a little bit stressed, and so they didn't have the emotional bandwidth to attune to your exact needs. And this is this idea that abuse equals trauma. Sometimes you can just traumatize yourself. It can be based on the fact of your personality. I was a very sensitive child, so some things felt traumatic to me that weren't traumatic to somebody else, and nobody abused me. A great example of this is how I fell down the escalators at Bond Street one day. And was I a bit traumatized with escalators after that? You bet I was. I was extremely careful getting on the escalator the next day. I wasn't wearing stilettos, I wasn't running, I was holding the rail like they tell you to on the announcement, and I suddenly, for the first time in my life, listened to it, right? Because I was a bit fearful of falling and tripping again. I had to go to A&E and get stitches, right? Did anyone abuse me? No, nobody pushed me. If anything, I tripped over myself because I didn't listen to the instructions and I was rushing. Sometimes you can experience trauma without being abused. And I really want to reiterate that, because this is where the block can happen, that sometimes in my clients' minds, what can happen is, if I label my childhood for what it really was, now that means I've got to blame someone and not like someone. And nothing could be further from the truth. Many of you had very well-meaning parents that just got it wrong a little bit. And maybe one day when you become a parent, you'll get a few things wrong too. And that's just because you're human. For some of you, you did come from very violent backgrounds. And I also want for you to feel seen and heard in this too. You maybe had an alcoholic parent. You maybe had a violent parent. And that is very legit and very valid. And definitely if you grew up in a childhood with any of these influences that just felt unsafe, then this content is going to be very relatable for you, right? Because there can also be subtle ways that this forms, right? These people-pleasing and these validation-seeking behaviors form. Maybe you felt like you had to be the easy child because, like I said, your parents just didn't have the bandwidth. Maybe they had bigger problems to make sure that you had opportunities elsewhere, so they had to work a lot or they had to prioritize something else. Maybe you were praised for being the low-maintenance child, right? Maybe you were praised for being emotionally attuned to a stressed parent. Again, you took on that adult role and you were able to modify how you behaved and how you acted and what personality you put forward depending on what your parents' mood was, right? Maybe you had a parent who was physically present but just emotionally gone with the cuckoos, right? They were just Their way of almost dealing with a stressful world was to go off into imagination land and dissociate, right? So they weren't really emotionally present for you, but they were physically present, right? Maybe you learned to be the listener, the helper, the peacekeeper. Maybe you grew up in a home where emotions weren't expressed safely, right? You don't need abuse or trauma for a pattern to form. And I just want to lighten that for you. Because sometimes when we come into this work and there's something that hasn't been looked at, you think, oh my God, now my whole life is going to be completely upheaved and we need to blame someone and we have to estrange someone and we have to... No, you don't. You don't actually need abuse or even trauma for a pattern to form. You just need repetition. And so your system repeats what it knows, because familiar equals safe and safe equals survival, even if it's not good for you. Now, in video 1, we talked about how the nervous system prioritizes connection over discernment. In this video, we're talking about why your nervous system is wired that way. Because the reason is because the people who raised you, right, your first emotional environment, were the blueprint your system internalized, right? When you meet someone in dating who mirrors the emotional tone of that environment, unpredictability, distance, intensity, inconsistency, emotional labor, it feels familiar in your body. It doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel healthy, it feels familiar. And familiarity is extremely powerful. It overrides logic, it overrides awareness, it overrides red flags. And this is why attraction can feel chemically intense with the wrong men. And it can feel flat, boring, and just plain out, downright vanilla with the right ones, right? It's not because you like dysfunction, it's not because you're drawn to toxicity, but because your nervous system coded unhealthy patterns as normal, right? So you're not addicted to the man, you're addicted to the emotional pattern he represents. And once you see this, everything changes, because suddenly you stop blaming yourself, queen. Stop feeling defective, right? Stop telling yourself that there's something wrong with you. Stop thinking that you have bad taste, you just like the F-boys, you love the chase. You actually don't like any of that, and you kind of already know that, right? You stop assuming emotionally healthy men are boring, right? You actually get more explorative around it. You stop repeating the same story about your attraction pattern, right? And you start to understand that you were never choosing wrong. Your system was choosing familiar. And that's the whole point of this video. To name the true source of the pattern, because when you can name something clearly, you stop believing it says something about your worth, right? And you start understanding that this was just something that you were almost a little bit programmed to do. It's, again, like we talked about in one of the past videos, your nervous system just needs to update the software that you learned in your childhood, and it is something that is happening on autopilot, right? So it is nothing to do with your worthiness of finding love. And honestly, when you get stuck in this loop of thinking, I just can't find the right partner, there must be something wrong with me, men don't find me attractive, maybe I'm presenting as a big fat red flag when I'm turning up on that day, and you're almost shaming yourself for imperfections that you might feel you have that are actually relatively minor, right? And you now understand that the whole dynamic is wrong, that you are choosing something very familiar, and so you are literally giving yourself no option but to play out the role that you played out in your childhood, that now that you're an adult and you actually get to choose who you hang around with and who you date and what your future adult family is going to be, you actually have the privilege to choose differently if that's something that you would like to do. You now understand why your system keeps choosing familiar patterns. Now that you get that, the next question is, how do women who are breaking these patterns actually make different choices in real dating situations? If you are interested in learning how these women do that, then click the next video to find out, and I am sending you so much love. Take care.